Welcome to this afternoon's Spark in AI Summit General Session. My name is Lady Cabral, and I lead the Diversity and Inclusion Program at Databricks. I'm proud to introduce our guest keynote speakers today and over the next few days. But first, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what I believe is our collective responsibility to address racial and social injustice. I'm passionate about diversity and inclusion because I believe it ensures that people have the freedom and safety to be themselves. I believe deeply that every individual should have that right, whether at home, at work, or anywhere in between. When people feel like they belong, they're inspired and motivated to be their best. However, as our history reminds us and recent events have brought to the forefront, the feeling of freedom and safety is still missing for millions of people around the world. Whether based on race, gender, or sexual orientation, discrimination and social injustice remain deeply systemic issues that demand action. Over the last month, in the midst of an already incredibly challenging time, it has been inspiring to see people around the world coming together, both in their personal and professional lives, to demand justice and help drive meaningful and lasting change. In the context of creating change, I'm very excited about what this group will do. How can we use data to learn more about and help solve the world's toughest social problems? What kind of products can we build that will also help us eliminate biases? How can we help cultivate and preserve a sense of belonging for everyone? Diversity and inclusion is everyone's job. It is our collective and constant responsibility, one that I hope we adhere to and hold each other accountable to in our lives. On a personal level, I'm humbled to be part of a community that can make such a massive difference. That's why I'm excited for today's guest keynotes. Our speakers will focus on current issues and events, from racial and social justice to other issues like COVID-19 and the elections, and the important role of data and AI in helping people, organizations, and governments better understand and solve the toughest issues around them. I hope you enjoyed today's talks and that you're inspired to join us in supporting the important cause that Ali talked about earlier today. To do so, click on the Donate Now button in your dashboard. As a reminder, Databricks will match all donations up to $100,000. And now for our first speaker. Dr. Phillip Atiba Goff is the president and co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. As a research and action think tank, Center for Policing Equity produces analyses identifying and reducing the causes of racial disparities in law enforcement. Using evidence-based approaches to social justice, they use data to create levers for social, cultural, and policy change. Please welcome Dr. Goff.
For the last 3 weeks, because of what it is that I do, a lot of people have been asking me, what is this? How am I supposed to make sense of it? When it first happened, it was obvious that we had all seen a slow motion public lynching, some for the first time. And the reaction in the streets was a protest of people who were tired. They were exhausted, not just from staying inside from the novel coronavirus, but they were exhausted from the names, the accumulation of the names like Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and obviously George Floyd. In Minneapolis, it had been Jamar Clark and Philando Castile and Blevin. But as the days went on, and the protests spread from Minneapolis to New York to Tallahassee to Texas to Idaho to Alaska to Berlin, people realized that this was not just about policing, or at least it felt bigger than that. I remember talking to an activist in the first week of the events. I was worried about him because activists get targeted by law enforcement, by employers. And so I asked him, are you going to go back out? And in his response, saying he felt like he had to, he said, the pain I feel is too big to fit in my body. And without thinking, I responded, I said, that's because the pain that we're feeling is too big to fit into a lifetime. This is generations worth of agony. The way I've described it before and today and tomorrow will be, we're seeing the past due notice for the unpaid debts owed to Black communities for 400 plus years. And the urgency of now is the interest that's accumulated on top of that. And it's important to understand that as the central element of what we're seeing, because if we imagine that the problem is just policing, then we're going to have solutions that are way too small. Even if we fixed all of policing, imagining that was possible without dealing with everything else, then we'd be stuck with a small chunk of what people really need and paying this debt over and over and over again. So for this audience, to a group of data scientists, right? Those of us who work every day in Python and in R and in Stata, if we labor in Excel sheets, it can feel as if our work is so far removed from the vital lived realities of what's happening every day. We can manage that by taking to the streets with protesters, making signs, donating to our causes. But when we get back to the work in the day, it can leave your mouth feeling tasteless, right? And I'm happy to say that when you understand the part of the problem, the biggest part of the problem, the way to frame the problem is that we haven't had an honest accounting of all that we've done, all the targeted abuse and the benign neglect of Black communities. Counting problems are problems that data nerds and justice nerds that we're actually exactly equipped for. So publicly, part of what I talk about is the need to strap in, the need to get yourself emotionally prepared for the moment when the cameras turn away. We're coming really close, right? I've started to see that the top of the news shows are about campaigns or about the COVID numbers, all very important, but they've ceased to be about the protests if the protests are even better organized, bigger, but less violent. So it's time now to start strapping in and saying, I'm not going to allow myself to be less activated about this moment just because I'm not seeing it on my screens every day. But for this audience, for y'all, there's more that you can do. You can take on small projects in your neighborhood, in your city, in your county, in your state. You can take on the job of saying, all right, so how many people aren't just having force used on them? How many people end up in the hospital? How many times do police have contact with kids in my neighborhood, in my city? If the data aren't public, you can ask. And if they say no, you can FOIA it because the data belong to the people. You can do these bits of accounting that other people can't, that the country hasn't. I can't overstate how important it is to just do those measurements. I know that when I was growing up, my parents measured everything. Well, not everything, but they measured my height. They measured, my grades. They literally talked about how many friends I had as a proportion of the people I could be friends with in my grade. My parents were nerds. But it also was one of the ways that they cared. It's one of the ways that everybody cares. If you grew up in a family that struggled with money, you know that when you go to the grocery store, you're counting in your head every dollar and every cent. If you grew up in places where you had money, probably the budget was a really important thing for your parents. And for everybody who is part of and runs a business, you're paying attention to the things that the company you work for or that you run values most. How on earth can you live in a world where the things you care about, you don't bother to measure, right? Even love, we pay attention to the amount of time that we get, the kind of attention that we get. All the things we care about, we measure. I cannot overstate how painful it is that we've neglected to measure the terror that the state does in the most vulnerable communities in the United States. How would it feel if the people who have the power to measure every little move that you make online, every little dollar that you make in every little way, didn't bother to measure the number of times that their agent sent you to the hospital and sent your neighbors to the morgue? So unlike what I say publicly, you all can do more than just get emotionally prepared to strap in, because there will be another George Floyd. And the cameras will not catch it, and the story will be very different from law enforcement than what happened, and we will have no way of knowing. but we can start the process of having an honest accounting, and you all can help. And if you're looking for more ways, you can log on to our website, right, policingequity.org. But you all are creative. I want you to be thinking about ways we haven't thought of yet, ways that we can't because we're dealing with the tsunami of unprocessed data from law enforcement. And I don't just want this to be a law enforcement problem. So that's the first thing I want to make sure that you all knew. But the second thing I want to be talking about is how we move forward in addition to that honest accounting. Once we have any kind of sense of how big or how many or how long, there are lots of calls right now to be doing things that are radically unimaginable to a lot of the country 3 weeks ago. I'm talking mostly about the calls for defunding the police, right, which may sound kind of bananas, especially in context where you think about, well, what happens when I'm having my house broken into? What happens when someone is committing a violent felony? Right? Surely the police there. And first, it's important to know defund the police means many different things to many people. There's one extreme of it, which is literally full abolition. There's no law enforcement anymore. The community can handle it themselves. But what I hear most from Black communities, what polling says Black communities are more interested in, like what activists tell me when I'm sitting in meetings with them, is that we have had generations of defunding Black communities. So look at the history of mental health hospitals in California, right? We had mental health hospitals. We had public hospitals for folks who were mentally ill. They were difficult. It is not a success story of public investment. There was abuse, there was neglect, there was a lack of regulation. But what happens when you close them down is you give them a set of antipsychotic drugs. You say, I hope you're able to take these when you're supposed to. You have no home. Sometimes your families are scared to bring you in. And instead of having public accommodations, we have law enforcement. We have public education, which used to be part of the way in which the country created so much wealth. But increasingly, we've pulled back from investments in public education. We've taken that out. We've defunded public education. We've allowed it to become privatized, right? Which is why charter schools end up being such a big deal. Right? I'm not going to delve into that debate, but the idea is that why is it that those who are most vulnerable can't have the things that privatization is supposed to offer? Lots of reasons for it and debates to be had. Not my thing, at least not today. But the point is you wouldn't have to do that. We wouldn't be having that debate if we had invested in public education. We've taken that out. The ACLU estimates that there's 14 million kids going to school right now in schools that have police officers, but no nurses, no counselors, no psychologists, no therapists. And in places where I've worked in the Midwest and in the South, you oftentimes have to drive an hour or more to get to a grocery store that has fresh vegetables. So we've defunded public education, we've defunded public health, we've defunded substance abuse, we've defunded mental health. And the only public good that we put any money into in many of the most vulnerable communities, poor white communities, and especially urban Black communities, is the police. That's why in some communities, you're more likely to get taken to the hospital in the back of a Black and white squad car than you are in an ambulance. So in those conversations, in those communities, what they're talking about when they say defund the police is if we're going to keep defunding Black communities, at least allow Black communities to decide where the little money that gets poured in there goes. That we can take money out of law enforcement and we can put it into having 911 be able to dial social workers and marriage counselors and school psychologists, and public health advocates. The idea is that safe communities, public safety, begins with this notion that it'd be best if we didn't have to call the cops. And if we give communities the resources that allow them to do that, then we're giving them the resources, not just to defund the police, but to determine their own destiny. So it's not for me to tell protesters what their slogans should be, but I hope that people take that invest in Black communities is the thing that everybody agrees on in this. That regardless of what you mean by defund the police, invest in Black folks, that's the thing, because everybody wants folks to be in positions where they don't have to call police in the first place. So I want to point out two things about what that looks like. One is that if you're going to take money out of law enforcement or just invest in Black communities, it turns out you can't just throw money at the problem. You shouldn't just drop it from a helicopter, have folks fight over it, and then say the problem is done. You got to invest smartly. There's a lot of programs right now that have a ton of money, but they're regulated such that the most in need don't know how to get access to it. Data nerds can help. This is why justice nerds exist. Figure out how to set up the regulations so people can access the money and the resources that they need. Figure out what you can be investing in that has the greatest return on investment. You can't do that by feel. You should listen to Black communities for sure. They will give you the best lead to begin with. But even the folks who are living on the ground can't tell you the proportion that needs to go in one service versus the other. That's going to need analytics. That's going to need us. The other thing that I want to point out is that even if you cut law enforcement, let's say by 50%, let's say you cut the personnel of your local law enforcement by 50%, what on earth is the guarantee that law enforcement that's left is going to be just the good ones? That by slashing the budget, you've gotten rid of all the bad ones. And if they're there and they have fewer officers, which means they have less capacity, they're going to be stretched thinner. That's a recipe for disaster. So we can't just cut based on a feel that it needs to be smaller. We need to cut smart in the same way that we invest smart. So who are the officers that should be sticking around? I can tell you, if you cut randomly or you just cut based on budget, almost every union contract everyone I've ever seen, and I'm sure almost everyone in the country, says the last hired or the first fired, which means the most junior officers who are most progressive and are most capable of engaging in culture change are the first out the door, unless you figure out a different, smarter way to do it. And in the same way, whenever city budgets get cut, the after-school programs, the ability to have law enforcement be able to take care of, help clean up the park, take care of the elderly, those are the first ones to go. Those are exactly the ones that folks who are calling for defunding law enforcement don't want to see gone. So if we're going to cut programs and we're going to cut personnel, we better do that smart. And it's going to take a lot more nerds that are currently employed in law enforcement. Here's what I mean by that. There's roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States, give or take a couple, right? Of those 18,000, 75% of them are 25 officers or fewer, and 1,000 police departments are just one dude. It's always a dude. They don't have an IT department, right? They don't have a data system that keeps track of things. They've got, if they're lucky, Old Willie. Old Willie mostly works in the basement, full of mildew, with a bunch of cardboard boxes that have manila folders in it that are stained with ink fingerprints, nothing digital. It's in the basement where it floods about once every 18 months. And so mostly those pages are stuck together and are growing black mold. If you wanted to do a fun natural language processing project, what you could be doing is helping Old Willie transfer all of those files for the last 100+ years into something digital that would give us an archive to let us understand what's happening in the small departments. Because you're twice as likely to get shot and killed by law enforcement in a small department than you are in an urban department. Makes sense. Urban departments have more training, right? They've got better standards they're able to use. So small departments need our help. Deeply, they need the help. But it's also important to get that of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the US, not one of them has the exact same data system. And I shouldn't say data system because they've got at least 3. Almost every department has what's called a CAD system. That's the 911 dispatch system. They've got a records management system for what comes in, and they got an IA system, an internal affairs system. Now, sometimes use of force is captured in the CAD system, sometimes in the RMS, sometimes in IA. And those systems, you'll be shocked to hear, don't speak to each other. It's part of the reason why the Center for Policing Equity exists, is to start integrating those systems, auditing, cleaning, standardizing them so they can even be compared across systems. I'll tell you, that process is difficult. And another fun project for anybody who's listening to this to take on is helping your local law enforcement break into the late 1800s in terms of data collection and capture, right? Because I'll tell you, we've worked in departments that have tried to digitize their data, and the location information that they captured on a series of incidents just was the word cheese. I assume somebody was taking a lunch order and just wrote it down in the wrong place. But I'll tell you, when you're trying to get longitudinal and latitude data longitude and latitude data for that, it just gives you the state of Wisconsin, which is not useful. There are all of these things that are going to be necessary for reimagining how we do public safety and for giving back to the most vulnerable communities the power to determine what safety is like for them. And we're not going to get there just from the people who know how to write laws. We're not going to get there just from the people who know how to pass budgets. We're not even going to get there from the people who are experts in civil rights, community empowerment, and law enforcement. We're going to need nerds to make sure this happens responsibly. And I've been talking about all the things I can't overstate. I can't overstate this either. If we fail to do that, if the nerds don't show up, or we're not called in, or we don't do our jobs right, here's what's going to happen. Minneapolis that has announced it's going to take a year-long process to figure out how to disband their department. They're going to have a rise in crime. That rise in crime is going to be accompanied by a couple of really high-profile homicides, or sexual assaults, or both. And politicians are going to take those stories and they're going to tell mildly genuine stories of horror at all the awful things this terrible moment has led to. And we're going to see a backlash of the kind that we saw in the 70s and 80s and culminating in the 90s that led to the largest rise of mass incarceration in the history of our species. History moves in ebbs and flows. Civil rights movement was followed by incredibly regressive politics and a retrenchment of restrictions on civil rights, particularly on Black communities. If you're not a student of history, you may not know that immediately after emancipation was a period known by historians as the Reconstruction. It is still, to this day, the height of Black representation in elected office. We gave out money, tracts of land, gave out a bit of recompense for the hundreds of years of slavery. But still, the majority of time that this country has been a country by this name. And that Reconstruction period was followed by what we understand by historians as the nadir. The stripping of all of those protections, the stripping of rights, the institution of poll taxes, and then the code we now understand as Jim and Jane Crow. We're at a moment in history where real progress can be made, where it's possible to imagine a really different world because the virus that has been stalking our species for the last several months is forcing us to think about a different kind of way. It turns out, right, that what's behind me in your eyes isn't really here. The whole world is different. And Zoom meetings are the norm and are likely to stay with us for a while. Working from home is a real thing. Kids and pets interceding on our business meetings, all of that is with us for some time in the future. We're already actively imagining a different world. And we can be doing the same thing on equity as we're doing that on public health. We have to. And people by the millions in the streets are calling for it. But if the nerds fail to show up in the way that we need to, this period of promise, of imagining a new world beyond being forced to stay in your house, is going to be met with the kind of scapegoating that also can come from these moments. And I am not sure which path we're going to be able to choose, but I do definitely know that nerds, data nerds, justice nerds, we're going to play a big role. And so now is the time to start getting ready for whatever role you want to and can play, to step up and to strap in. Because the role we're going to play, as is often the case, is not all that sexy. I'm sorry, folks. Learn to live with it. It's not sexy, and it's not going to be in the front of the cameras. It's not going to be at the front of the movement. But without it, failure is absolutely guaranteed. And the things that we all feel like we might be able to grasp for the first time, maybe in our lifetimes, for the first time, maybe in the history of the country, we're going to be responsible for putting that firmly within reach. We're making another 50 to 100 years before we can touch it again. So, with this moment being as big as it is, I implore all of you, strap in, take up your pet projects, do more than the people around you who are feeling like they don't know how to tap in and they don't know how to contribute. Figure out a way to turn your data nerd status into justice nerd status, and not just with our merchandise. Make it part of your life. We can do that now, where we couldn't before.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. UC Berkeley has been at the forefront of educating the next generation of data science practitioners and researchers. So we're honored to have Jennifer Chase with us today. She's the newly appointed Associate Provost for UC Berkeley's Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society. And she'll talk about how her division is building bridges across a diverse set of programs, which fits perfectly with the theme of this summit. She'll describe how the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the ramp-up of this new division and the interdisciplinary research and collaboration it fosters. Let's give a warm welcome to Jennifer Chase.
Thanks so much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to be talking about machine learning and data science at Cal and how we have formed a new division which we believe will transform research and education to meet societal challenges. This work is done with Kathy Yellick, who is the Associate Dean of our new Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society. So, computing and data science at Cal. What we have in this new division, which is called Computing, Data Science, and Society, is a core of computing and data science in addition to cross-campus partnerships, both for educational and for research purposes. So in the new division, we have a department which many of you know, the EECS department at Berkeley. We also have the statistics department, and we have the School of Information. In addition to that, we have something which we're calling the Data Science Commons, which are partnerships, research partnerships with faculty between the core disciplines and all the other disciplines on campus. Now, we are the unparalleled leader in data science education. In fact, that is how the division started, with the data science major. As of now, less than 2 years after we started the major, we have over 1,000 declared majors. Over 6,000 students take data science classes every year. We have hundreds of students TAing and helping to teach this class. And between data science and CS, the CS major and the EECS major, we are the #1 talent producer for Silicon Valley. We're going to convene this new division in a building yet to be built, which we're calling the Data Hub. It is going to be a huge building on a wonderful site in the northwest corner of campus. We started out with a gift from an amazing anonymous donor, a gift of over $250 million. We're still doing more fundraising. And this site will house and convene these partnerships. So here are some of the research themes that we are going to be looking at. We're going to take the core of computing and data science and statistics and information, and we are going to connect across campus with various initiatives, which you see here. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on one, public health. And the reason I'm focusing on this is just, a short time after this division was formed to meet societal challenges, we had one of the greatest societal challenges in a very long time. This is the COVID-19 pandemic. And this really requires rapidly putting together cross-disciplinary research teams to tackle many aspects of the problem. You see some of them here, and you also see some themes like security and privacy and scale. So I will tell you about roughly 8 or 9 different research projects that are all rapid responses to COVID-19. The first is a project by Bin Yu and her collaborators. She has many external collaborators and many students working with her on this. And this is to predict hospital demand. So here we were back in mid-March, and we had no idea where the new hospital demands were going to arise. Okay, we knew that there were outbreaks, and unfortunately, I think these outbreaks are not yet done. And so what Ben wanted to do was predict demand 7 days out so that we could get PPE and ventilators to the hospitals that would need it most. The first thing that Ben's team did was data curation. They put together about 20 different hospitals and county data sets. On these, they tried many different models, came up with a weighted combination of 5 of those models that very accurately predicts hospital demand. They also built visualizations so that this could be used by less technical folks. One of the many things they've done is to figure out where to deliver over 1 million face shields worldwide. Okay, the next project I'm going to talk about is data to help the most vulnerable. Josh Blumenstock, who's in the School of Information at Berkeley, has a long-time project to try to understand where we find pockets of poverty in the undeveloped world. It's not at all obvious how you do this. It's not like we have voter registration rolls or, we know where people are filing taxes from like we do in the developed world. So in countries like Togo, for example, how do we know? What data sources do we have? And how can we use them? And so Josh has put together mobile phone data. These are usually not smartphones. They're usually pretty primitive phones. And satellite data. And from those, he has found latent variables which predict poverty with remarkable accuracy. So he takes the whole country and he divides it up into 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer squares. And he can point to the ones where the poverty is worst. Now, when COVID hit, it wasn't just a public health crisis due to the pandemic. It's a public health crisis in many of these countries due to acute hunger and starvation. An estimate that over 250 million people would suffer from acute hunger and over 30 million would die of starvation just due to COVID-19. And so Josh has worked with the government of Togo at the highest levels to figure out where to distribute microloans, to take people from acute hunger and starvation back to the just surviving side. And he's doing similar work with Bangladesh, with Uganda, with Afghanistan. Okay, the next project I want to talk about was done by Euros Seljak at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and also with collaborators not only at LBL, but also at hospitals in northern Italy, in particular in the Bergamo and Lombardy regions of northern Italy. You'll probably remember that these were some of the worst hit regions in the world at an early point in the outbreak of COVID-19. And so, they reported mortality based on death certificates, but those numbers were just way, way off. They were significant underestimates. So Euros and his colleagues looked at mortality data in different age classes over the last 5 years. They also combined it with data from the Princess cruise ship, and they corrected for the underestimate, finding that more than twice as many people died as were actually recorded as COVID deaths. Moreover, they found that the discrepancy increased with age very, very dramatically. It was quite close for people 40 through 49. It was many factors off, almost an order of magnitude off for people 90 and above. The next project is using NLP. So we believe that the literature, probably the medical literature, probably contains a lot of information of relevance to treating COVID. However, it obviously won't be labeled as such. No one knew about COVID-19 at that time. So what a group consisting of people at Lawrence Berkeley Lab and UC Berkeley did was that, and this was following similar work they had done in material science, but here for the medical literature and the biological literature of relevance to COVID, they looked at a word embedding, and from that were able to understand which previous papers might actually have relevant information on proteins, genes, symptoms, and possible drugs that already exist. So they have analyzed over 80,000 papers and patents, increasing that by 1,500 a week, and they have over 1,000 unique users per week. Talking about drugs, how about drug design? So Jennifer Listgarten, who's in the EECS department at Berkeley, has been working for a number of years now on small molecule drug design. She's using a machine learning set of techniques for how to invert very high dimensional spaces. The problem is that there are just too many possible small molecules. So Jen has developed ways of finding the most relevant ones for certain purposes. Here, what she wants to do is use those techniques to find small molecules that prevent the binding of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to the human cell. So, things like the ACE2 receptor that seems to be highly implicated in getting COVID-19. So she is looking for molecules that would prevent that binding. Okay, we also have some studies coming out of the School of Public Health. This is a really interesting study to help the Berkeley campus and other campuses figure out how to safely reopen. This one is done by Maya Peterson, Art Reingold, and their collaborators from the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics in the Berkeley School of Public Health. And so what the problem is here is that you want to take in many different sources of data, app-based data on symptoms, exposure, mobility, beacon-based contacts. Talk a little more about this in the next slide. You want to talk in place-based data, like looking at air filter data, that kind of thing. Taking in aggregate public health data. And then you want a machine learning-based risk prediction model to tell you who is most likely to contract the disease. Most epidemiologists agree that you are not going to control an epidemic only by testing symptomatic people. You must do some testing of asymptomatics. But how do you do that? You test everybody all the time. There are models that say that people should be tested every 2 or 3 days to really control an epidemic. Other models say only once a month, so these models really differ. But how do we use the limited resource of testing and surveillance when we have so many people to test? So Art, Maya, and their collaborators are doing a test on, are doing an experiment with matched cohorts. There's one cohort of students in student housing, about 1,000, a matched cohort not in the dorms. There is a cohort of faculty and graduate students and staff who have gone back into the labs, and a demographically matched cohort who are still sheltering in place. And we want to look at the incidence of disease and we want to use this machine learning based smarter way to determine which asymptomatics we should test. Okay, coming out of the RISE lab from EECS, David Culler, Joey Gonzalez, and their collaborators are helping us to do digital contact tracing. There are many groups across the country and across the world trying to do this, often with phone-based apps based either on the iPhone or the Android platform. So you can have phones from many different places, and there are a couple of twists that the Berkeley group has. So they are also looking at fixed location Bluetooth devices. You could do this either with a phone, or you could do this with a dongle or a bracelet. There's a lot of advantage to place-based devices. And they also have come up with a commons that contains some, although no private or health data, some data. So what do we need to do all of this better? Okay, what we have is we have data, some of it quite private, like health-based, or if we use the location-based beacons, we want to do computation on that. Well, this is really a federated learning challenge, okay? So as all of you know, federated learning is a method for having a lot of data coming in on edge devices like phones, okay? You want to perform, there's some models sitting up in the cloud. You want to perform some learning locally on the edge devices, sharing just enough information to learn something globally. And of course, you want to preserve privacy in these cases. Okay, there are many algorithms for federated learning. We have faculty at Berkeley who have been working on questions of compressing data streams at the edge for their whole careers. Jelani Nelson, when he was in grad school, had a very important paper on what is called sketching. So you replace models at the edge by small mergeable summaries, and he had a very important paper on this in 2010. This year, Martin Wainwright, who is in the statistics department at Berkeley, came up with a way of merging data from different edge devices. This is very important because if I find the optimum on several edge devices and then I take that and I average it, it might not, in fact, odds are it will not be the minimum of the original problem. And so Martin and collaborators found out ways to use operator splitting for distributed convex minimization when you had additive structure. Finally, I want to mention some work coming out from the Spark community, from Jan Stojka, Joey Gonzalez, Raluca Popa, and their collaborators. And what they did was they looked at oblivious cooperative queries. So coopetition is a case in which you need to merge your data, you need to cooperate, but you also are competing, hence coopetition. And what they're doing is they're using hardware enclaves for secure distributed analytics among competing parties. So for example, if each hospital had its own data in its own hardware enclave, this is certainly happening with many hospitals, how do we do a query against those without revealing information? And how do we also protect from side channel attacks on that information, right, through memory and network access patterns? So their OCQ is implemented on an Apache Spark query planner and execution engine. And you may if you're a cryptographer, you may have said to me, well, why don't you just use secure multi-party computation? This OCQ is 200 times faster. This is just a small taste of the COVID work, the rapid response work that has occurred in computing and data science across Berkeley in the last couple of months. And so our new unit is here to do computing and data science, to strengthen the core and to solve societal problems. The differentiators of Berkeley are that we, of course, have excellence at the core in ECS and statistics and information. We also have excellence across all other fields. We do this at a scale which is almost unprecedented. And finally, the really special aspect of Berkeley is an incredible sense of social commitment. So please do come and visit us at the Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society at Berkeley. Thanks for letting me tell you about it.
Thank you, Dr. Chase. We're truly honored to have our next speaker with us today. As the founder and editor-in-chief of 538.com, Nate Silver is the preeminent election forecaster in the United States. With presidential elections only a few months away, we're really looking forward to what he has to say. After a technical talk on data analysis in the age of big data, Nate will answer questions on the nuts and bolts of building complex election forecasting models. Plus, he'll give us tips for how to convey probabilities and uncertainty to the general public. So please welcome Nate Silver.
Hey everybody, I am Nate Silver. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of 538 and the author of this book, The Signal and the Noise, Why So Many Predictions Fail But Some Don't, which I wrote 8 years ago, 2012. 8 years is kind of a long time. It also took 4 years to write the book. And of course, I had a lot of experience working in analytics before writing the book and collecting stories to the book, doing my own research for 538 and the book and projects before and after that. So given that we're now in a time of such profound uncertainty, or so it seems, I just want to spend this presentation reviewing and kind of reflecting where we stand in the field of data analytics. And in fact, like the themes are very true to things I talked about in the book 8 years ago. I'm not saying the big picture things have changed very much, but in light of politics, in light of coronavirus, in light of everything else, I think it's always useful to take a fresh perspective and see kind of the tension between how things look in theory and kind of how things look in reality on the ground. It's not all going to be coronavirus and politics. We're going to have a few fun stories about sports and poker and things like that, but I do want to increase the focus too on kind of some of the more pressing things that we see today. One of the basic contrasts really is between kind of the big promise of big data and analytics and kind of if you were in 2012, people were very excited about, oh, we kind of can press a button and write a program and we can kind of solve all these problems, right? You would hear a lot of statistics like this is from IBM, for example, that 90% of the world's data at any given time has been created in the past 2 years. That sounds like great, right? We're solving all these problems, except if you think about what's kind of happened over the past decade or so, it's been a lot of things that that were problematic or unpredictable or both, right? Ranging again from elections to coronavirus here in the middle of the worst pandemic since the Spanish flu. You also have some of the biggest protests arising in the US since 1968. We have also all the stuff that goes on in the background, like earthquakes, and we are in a big recession right now, and terrorist attacks and hurricanes and all of that stuff. You know, I would recommend, by the way, if you want to read the book, we talk about almost all these things in some detail in the book. But the contrast between the promise that we think big data creates and the fact that the world doesn't seem to be becoming more predictable, I think is something that we need to confront a little bit more head on potentially. By the way, it's not just these big newsworthy events that can create tension and surprises and problems. It's also in some of the most scientifically minded fields of all, like medicine, for example, or psychology, where only about, depending on which study you read, only about 35 to 40 to 50% of scientific findings can be successfully replicated, meaning that you publish a result in a journal, you say it's statistically significant, we have a big discovery. Another researcher tries to recreate the same finding, and they actually fail to do that as often or more often than not. So why does this occur? This is a big problem, for example, when you read all these studies around coronavirus treatments and vaccines and things like that, where there'll be some promising initial discovery, whether it's about a therapy, for example, or it might be about, if not a therapy, then some hypothesis about how the disease might spread. Maybe it's indoors and not outdoors, or maybe it's aerosols or whatever else. But you'll find that sometimes these findings aren't robust when people go back and look at them again. So I will try in this presentation to talk about why some of that can occur. So one thing I think people don't think about very much is that when you gather more data, that actually leads sometimes for more room for interpretation or disagreement, right? It used to be that in political analysis, my specialty is looking at political polls, forecasting elections. It used to be that, hey, 30 or 40 years ago, you would have a few big national polls. You'd have the NBC poll, and the CBS poll, and the New York Times poll, the ABC News poll, right? You would have maybe a few high-quality state polls in Ohio or Iowa or whatnot. But you didn't really have nearly as rich the amount of data that we have today, which on the one hand seems like, oh, it's really disappointing, right? We can't have as much precision on how we look at every swing state and make these fancy maps. Sites like 538 couldn't really work very well when you barely have polling in many states, right? On the other hand, when you have lots and lots and lots of data, then there's lots of room to argue about it potentially. Here, for example, is our chart from 538 showing what the polls showed over the course of the Iowa caucus. We expend a lot of effort to figure out how much you want to smooth the data and how you want to kind of literally connect the dots. Even so, you had in Iowa, at some point, 4 different people actually led the Iowa caucus at some point in the polls. And it turned out you basically had 2 different winners to add to the confusion, where Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg each won Iowa, depending on exactly how which metric you look at. There's at least 3 different counts of the vote to make things even more confusing. So, so it certainly doesn't seem like as we get more data that we achieve more consensus. There's actually as much fighting and arguing and room for debate as ever before. And if we go back to 2016, the general election, there was a lot of controversy over election forecasts. What is important to note, though, is that you actually had people taking the same information, the same data. All these forecasts are looking at polls and sometimes economic data, but mostly just at polls, and coming up with very different answers. Where our forecast at 538 gave Trump about a 30% chance of winning. The Trump campaign itself allegedly also gave itself a 30% chance of winning. The other forecast gave him only a 1% chance or a 2% chance. And to me, working in probabilities, a 3 in 10 chance, or 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, whatever you want to call it, is very different than 1 in 50 or 1 in 100. So the kind of romantic notion that, hey, if we get all the data that we need, then that's the easy part, or that's the hard part solved, right? It's like, no, actually the hard part's in the actual analysis. The hard part is in the modeling. Often the hard part is in how you account for uncertainty, right? We can all look at the polls and say a certain candidate is ahead by 3 points. But how big is that margin of error? Is that margin of error symmetrical, or are there funny shapes to it and whatever else? How are different states related? Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, for example, those all went for Trump in 2016. Well, those states are all really correlated, as we call it, because you have the same types of white working class voters in each state. So it's not a surprise that if one domino falls, that the other 2 fall as well. So a big reason why our forecast, or the Trump campaign's forecast, gave him higher odds than others was because we understood how these states are not independent. You do not actually have 50 separate states voting at once. You have people voting all across the country and 50 manifestations of that in different parts of the country. Of course, like I said, there is a lot of second guessing as we have a new election in 2020 coming up soon. In fact, I'm kind of working on my 2020 model right now. It's kind of what I'm spending most of my time on as we speak. But there was kind of a real shift in perception before and after. Where before the election, people were surprised that we had Trump so high. Of course, after, people thought, well, why didn't you have Trump winning? There's a lot of second guessing. If you've ever been, of course, as most of you are, practitioners in analytics, people are really kind of results oriented and not process oriented. I think thinking more about your process is more important, and thinking more about probability is important. That if you have a forecast saying something should happen 30% of the time, then it actually should happen 3 out of 10 times, like a flush draw in poker or something that's supposed to happen some portion of the time. But I won't dwell too much on 2016 when we have so much other news to cover. You also see, though, when it comes to coronavirus, a lot of debates over how to interpret different data. And it does remind me a lot of polling, where one of the things about election polling is that you have 50 different states, and then you might each have 5 or 6 different polls per week. You can look at different versions of those polls, right? So there's lots of room to kind of cherry pick your way toward any narrative that you want within some degree of reason. And likewise here, you see, for example, you see lots of tweets like this, that Florida's positive rate is on a clear upward trajectory. You know, to me, I'm not sure if that's clear or not. Here are some graphs from the New York Times that looks at deaths in Florida and reported cases in Florida as of now a few weeks ago, if you're watching this in real time. But the point is that, like, we just kind of find more and more ways to argue. I am not a postmodern relativist or something. I am not saying that there's no absolute truth. What I'm saying is that motivated reasoning is a big issue, where we have things that confirm our priors, whether they're partisan priors or whatever else, and that can make us less inclined to accept more nuance and uncertainty, less inclined to understand when, you know, by the way, part of being pro-science is understanding behavioral science and how we are people who love to find things that tell us a story that we want to hear. That confirmation bias is really quite powerful. And kind of the longer I've been involved in covering politics and making forecasts and looking at data in a very, very public-facing way, the more I think people are getting worse and worse about having their beliefs and their priors confirmed and not realizing that they too, no matter how smart you are, that's often expert, smart people who are more prone toward creative interpretation of the data that might fit their beliefs. You have to be really, really careful and rigorous. Issue number 2 is the way in which complexity tends to increase as you increase the amount of data in the world. So if you imagine that you have just 5 variables, for example, you're trying to look at the relationship between, say, inflation and GDP growth. Well, there are 10 two-way combinations of variables that could run tests on, for example, but what happens when the universe of data begins to expand? Say instead of 5 variables, you instead have 10, when you start to see a geometric increase in the complexity of relationships. It's a bit like a meeting, or I guess a Zoom call now, right? Where if you go from having 5 participants to 10, the amount of chaos increases kind of at an exponential rate, potentially. The amount of tension between any 2 people, or the amount that people want to share things, becomes a lot more complex. But this kind of keeps going up, where if you look at economic data, for example, the Federal Reserve now publishes about 566,000 economic statistics they update in real time every day. So to look at all possible combinations of those, you would have 313,599,440,000 possible tests that you can run. And the problem here is that when you have kind of infinite or almost infinite amounts of data, then you can find something which is a 1 in 1 million coincidence, and you actually find quite a few of those in data sets that are this large. You know, it sounds like a little bit abstract, but this gets back to why, when I talked about before about the replication crisis, why do only 35 or 40% of findings replicate? Well, people will explore so many possible ideas that they will get very excited about things that happen because of chance alone, or because of bad data, or because, frankly, sometimes of bad research design. And so there are all kinds of ways to fool yourself. Let me give one more sort of abstract example here, but it's pertinent in epidemiology, and it's pertinent in research and a lot of other areas. But so imagine that we're looking for signals, and by signal I mean something which provides useful information about a relationship. Maybe, for example, trying to find coronavirus cases, for example. Maybe we're trying to find, if we're in investment, trying to find research strategies that actually work and are robust over the long term. So this depiction, imagine that you have, you see 10 red circles, these are signals, and the 10 black circles are noise, basically. They are false hypotheses. So, okay, but let's say that we are smart and we have an algorithm, we have our judgment, whatever else, and so we are able to filter out 80% of the false signals. Meanwhile, we were able to capture 80% of the true signals. That seems pretty good, right? We've made a lot of improvement from this kind of very signal poor environment initially. The problem is if you recombine these, because the initial signal was still so poor, you still actually have more false findings, the black ones, than true findings, the red ones. And again, this is pertinent in areas like diagnosing a disease, where if, for example, you give mammograms to women who are in their 40s, fortunately women in their 40s are fairly unlikely, have a low base rate of breast cancer, for example. So it turns out that an initial mammogram, if you're in your 40s, a woman, and it comes up positive, actually a majority of those cases are false positives the first time. So what you have to do is go through that filtering process a second time, and a third time, and maybe a fourth time. And then by then you finally filter out enough false positives to different types of tests where you have a more reliable signal. But this is why, for example, in clinical trials for some new vaccine for COVID, you're going to read lots and lots of very enthusiastic reports about stage 1 trials or initial promising results from therapies. And the fact is that probably the majority of these, maybe the vast majority of these, will not pan out, will fail at some phase or another. Now, the good news is that there are so many attempts at doing this where you are kind of playing a numbers game, and odds are also that of these many possibilities that some actually will work. You'll learn from the failures as well. But this is important to keep in mind when we have a brand new disease that's kind of taken over the world somewhat literally, unfortunately, learning a lot more about it, but we are kind of starting from an environment where there's a lot we need to learn and discover. The final problem is what happens when you get in environments that are competitive, where you have one interpretation of the data and other people might have a different interpretation of the same evidence. So an example here that I like to give is back from pre-COVID days when I was giving a talk in person at the Guggenheim Museum in Manhattan. You see here where my apartment is in Manhattan, and how do you get from point A to point B? Well, it would seem like it's pretty simple, right? Of course, there's a lot of traffic, so it's a slow drive, but basically you just take a left on Madison Avenue and you drive north for 30 minutes or so, and then it's pretty straightforward. So that's how you would, if you look at Google Maps, how they would get from point A to point B. By contrast, this is the actual route that my Uber driver took that day. So we crossed through Central Park 3 times to the loop-de-loop at 72nd Street or so, and finally got to the Guggenheim about 45 minutes late. So the question is, why was this driver taking this route? This was not a very efficient route whatsoever. You would figure with all these people in Manhattan, this is not the way most people would go. Well, it turns out that the driver, or the GPS, not the driver's fault, it was the GPS's fault, or the routing software, I should say, was very intrigued by this road that cuts north through south through Central Park called East Drive. So East Drive is a real road. Most of the time it is reserved for people who are biking and jogging, but at certain times of day it's open for through traffic. The problem is that the GPS thought that East Drive was open at 2 p.m. or whatever it was on a Tuesday, when in fact that's one time when it's closed. And so it was trying to take advantage of this signal that turned out to be basically a bad data point, right? So of course, the driver was like, okay, if I can get on this, there's no traffic there, it's a shortcut, I will save lots and lots of time. But very often when you kind of find something that is too good to be true, then it actually is. This kind of applies almost to whatever you're doing, right? If you are making an investment and taking one side of the trade, and then, okay, why are the other people taking the other side of the trade if they have about the same information that you have, right? If someone wants to sit down in a poker game and play you, they seem very eager to invite you to the game, you should maybe ask yourself, okay, am I the sucker here potentially? And again, I'm not someone who says that markets are always right. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think if we didn't have people who tried to beat markets, the markets actually wouldn't be any good. But a competitive environment is a lot different than one in which we're the only person out there looking for intelligence and for signals. Okay, so I want to move now into the more, I guess, optimistic part of this to start to suggest some heuristics for how we can go about doing better analysis. And none of these are terribly technical, right? You see here a sign depicting Bayes' theorem that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but Bayes' theorem is a very old algebraic formula that just tells you how to weigh new information and how much to update your beliefs given what you know already. If you are in a meeting, you probably are familiar with the concept where you kind of walk in and you're very, or maybe you're Zoom in now, right? You don't really know very many people, you're very naive, and you kind of refine your views as you get more information. In some ways, it's a very intuitive process, but it does involve some things that that are important to keep in mind whenever we're doing analysis. So 3 things, and these all kind of stem from Bayes' theorem. Idea number 1, think probabilistically. Idea number 2, know where you're coming from. And idea number 3 is try and error. So I'm going to explain each one of these in a little bit of detail here. So if you know anything about, about 538 or know anything about my work, then we are kind of obsessed with probabilistic forecasts instead of deterministic ones, right? So whether it's Trump having a 29% chance of winning, or I don't know, the Toronto Raptors having a 51% chance to win the NBA Finals or something against the Warriors last year. You know, we've always kind of been obsessed with trying to measure uncertainty and add value in that way. And there's a reason for that, which is that there's a long history of people being poor about communicating uncertainty and actually confusing people and misleading people as a result. So I want to take an example here from weather forecasting. So imagine, instead of this kind of very ugly PowerPoint slide you're looking at, that imagine looking at a beautiful river in North Dakota called the Red River of the North. And what happens there is that there's a lot of snow, obviously, up in North Dakota. So roughly speaking, every March, that snow begins to melt. And if that snow melts pretty fast, then you have the risk of flooding in the rivers in North Dakota. So one year in 1997, there was a particularly large risk of flooding. The Weather Service issued a forecast saying, hey, look, we have done the math. This is not like Hurricane Katrina. This flood is happening, or the water is melting slowly, but predictably and kind of inevitably. But it'd say, we've done the math, and look, on the worst day, we think the flood waters will crest at 49 feet. So people in Grand Forks, North Dakota said, okay, well, that's okay. 49 feet is a little scary, but we have flood walls that go up to 51 feet. And so we can do the math here. 51 is greater than 49. So what's the big problem, right? Well, the big problem was this, that the margin of error on the forecast made weeks in advance was plus or minus 9 feet. So in fact, there was almost a 35 or 40% chance that the levees would be toppled by the water. In fact, that's of course what happened. The water's actually crested at 53 feet on the worst day of the flood. So you're actually well within the margin of error. It's a good forecast in that sense, but it's a binary outcome where all of a sudden now almost all the town is flooded. People did get out with their lives, not a lot of loss of life, but you did have fairly severe flooding and a lot of uninsured property damage that could have been avoided if people had actually looked at the margin of error. The problem was, though, the Weather Service really de-emphasized the margin of error in their communications about the flood. They were afraid that if you convey uncertainty, that people think that, hey, you don't know what you're doing. I think we need to really reverse that perception all the time in society, right? To me, if I am evaluating, say, a job candidate at 538, and they come in with a model, and they say, hey, look, I can predict with 100% accuracy who's going to win the next election, I would tell them politely to get out, right? Because you can't have a model that is that accurate. That means that you've done something wrong, probably overfit would be one way to do it, or kind of p-hack your way, minimize uncertainty. Instead, we want to measure this and quantify this and try to calibrate it so that when we actually say there's a 30% chance, it actually does happen about 30% of the time and not more or not less. And again, when it comes to COVID, you'll sometimes see kind of public health agencies talk about uncertainty in really odd ways, right? With masks, for example, where most of the evidence kind of now points toward masks potentially being very helpful to wear. Well, at first, the WHO, the CDC, other places were like, well, it's not proven that masks work, therefore maybe you shouldn't wear them, right? Well, you know, that's actually not very helpful. If you're trying to deal with problems in real time, and having the near preponderance of evidence saying, hey, we think masks probably work, it might not be proven, but like actually it's probably still a good, relatively low-cost way to prevent and lower the risk of spread. Would have been to have everyone kind of wear masks, not just starting in April and May, but back in March. It might have been a lot better that way, frankly. So, you know, encourage people to include probability, to include complexity in their explanations, and not kind of shouting them down when it seems like they have a more nuanced answer, I think is really, really important. By the way, I don't mean to make too much fun of weather forecasters. In fact, if you read The Signal and the Noise, are kind of the heroes of the book. Weather forecasts have gotten an awful lot better over the course of the past 30 or 40 years. If You see, for example, how accurate the forecast was for Hurricane Irma when it hit Florida a couple of years ago. And yeah, the track shifts a little bit. People sometimes think it's overly precise in terms of the exact county or city, but basically these things are improving a lot. So for example, about 30 years ago, if you had a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, on average, there was about a 350-mile error between the forecast and where that hurricane actually hit. So 3 days in advance, you might have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. It would hit anywhere between half the time between Houston and Tallahassee, Florida, roughly. The other half would be somewhere else entirely. It would hit Mexico or curl up and hit North Carolina or whatever else, right? It's like not very useful and actionable intelligence. Nowadays, forecasts are within about 100 miles on average 3 days in advance. You can see on the map that a 100-mile radius is actually very actionable, where you can evacuate the Jersey Shore or evacuate Houston or New Orleans or a place like that. And although we have not found a way to stop hurricanes or prevent property damage, there is much less loss of life now from most hurricanes because we have a better forecast and more advanced warning, and that has led to leaps and bounds worth of improvement in terms of saving people's lives from these storms. By the way, before we go too much further, I want to stipulate I am not going to talk in these prepared remarks about the 2020 election. I'm going to save that instead for the Q&A, where I'm happy to take questions. That's for a lot of reasons. Maybe first and foremost is that we do not officially have our model ready yet, so we have no kind of authoritative take on the election yet. But of course, I have lots of insights. I have been working on the model, so I have some clues about what it might say. Of course, a very momentous election, but I want to kind of save the election talk for more of an interactive format and focus more on some of the kind of abstract principles and examples from other parts of the news and other parts of my life here. Uncertainty, of course, is also very important when it comes to looking at infectious disease, for example, where this is a forecast of coronavirus from a guy who actually formerly was a hockey analytics guy at MIT. He has what is so far the best coronavirus model. It uses machine learning. It's very sophisticated and smart. But it's another example where actually his model has really wide confidence bands. Or if you project out, for example, until August, well, it could be that we have as many as 2,500 people a day, or as few as 140 people a day dying per day from coronavirus. It's been about 1,000, for example, in late May and early June. So, people can get frustrated and say, well, you're trying to give you're trying to give such a wide range, you're kind of covering your ass, right? Well, the fact is that experience tells us that that's actually about as well as people can do. Given we don't know very much about people's behavior, we don't know that much about the disease itself. We don't know, for example, how much will transmission be lowered in the summer. We're just learning more about how, for example, protests might spread coronavirus, how Memorial Day barbecues might, whatever else people have been doing in May and June. That stuff makes it kind of hard to forecast. And again, there is no prize to be won from false certainty. You may feel good about it at the time. It may make it easier to pitch on TV or something, but we know from many years of experience that being able to build accurate confidence intervals and account for uncertainty is kind of where the actual skill comes in. So if you look for a COVID projection, the wider those ranges are, the more the person probably actually knows what he or she is doing. Idea number two is what I call know where you're coming from. So it means being aware that we each have a subjective point of view. Again, does not mean that there is no objective world, but we're all trying to grope at it with our own kind of jaded perspective. And so what are things you can do as a person or as an organization, maybe more importantly, to give yourself a better chance of actually perceiving what the objective world actually is? Well, I would recommend, in addition to my book, reading James Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds. He is an editor or writer at The New Yorker, and he talks about what characteristics tend to make crowds or groups wise versus what things make them dumb, can lead to groupthink, for example. So what do you have in a wise crowd? Number one, you actually have diversity. Diversity can mean having people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds and different genders and different income classes and whatever else from parts of the country or the world. I think that definitely helps and is important. But diversity also means, often related to that, having different modes of thought, different skill sets, different strengths and weaknesses, different tolerances for risk or whatever else. Look, if you take 100 smart people and put them in a room together, they may be brilliant, but if they all are smart in the same ways, then you may as well have just one person, right? So the whole notion of having a diverse crowd is having different skill sets and perspectives that are brought to bear to try to piece out what the real world actually looks like. Number two is independence, where people have to be empowered to actually articulate their view of the evidence. If people are not empowered to do that, then you are going to have groupthink over almost for sure. Having organizations where you're allowed to question your boss, right? I kind of am people's boss now at 538, and one thing that's actually pretty hard is to make sure that people are able to give you feedback and aren't fearful of the results and consequences of that, right? I think I'm pretty good at that, but it can be intimidating sometimes to people. Making sure in governments, for example, that people aren't all trying to impress the governor or the mayor or the president, for example, and having groupthink that way. So having real incentives for independent thinking is important. And the third characteristic is decentralization. So if people can really pick up local information and knowledge on the ground, in some ways is very much related to diversity, that seems to help a lot too. If you can actually add net information to the problem, not just kind of regurgitate the same data, then that can add value as well. Of course, when we're in very polarized times politically, then people can take very different views of the same underlying facts, right? So right now, for example, if you look at, okay, what were views initially of the protests as they were unfolding in early June? It was literally almost 50-50 between people who saw them as protests primarily on the one hand, and people who saw them as violent, even riots, on the other hand. Again, it's not a surprise if you followed American politics that polarization is increasing. But I think it's important to be able to keep in mind that when you are looking at something from your point of view, and we're now on social media all the time, we're now in environments where we're able to easily kind of share our points of view and able to kind of filter together what we consume and the media that we read and get affirmation or confrontation, whatever else that way. It's pretty important not to get in what you might call a filter bubble where we only kind of see things that tell us a certain side of the story. If you look at the Democratic primary, for example, when Joe Biden won, that surprised a lot of people, even though, especially on Twitter, on social media, even though Biden had been ahead in the polls for all of last year, he did fall behind after Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada, but he had been one of the front runners all year long. It was not a huge shock that he won, but you don't encounter very many Biden supporters online that tend to be older and poorer, less digitally savvy, at least in the primary. And so, people need to understand that, like, what you might experience in your peer group, I'm not saying your peer group is wrong, right? You probably pick them carefully. You believe in their values. You may like their values. They probably have good values, right? But still being able to look at the world from different perspectives and being able to say, okay, look, I understand that I might be a smart person, but I have certain biases and certain beliefs and certain priors. So you have to kind of actually listen when someone approaches the world in a different way and does not just assume that they are misinformed or evil or corrupt or whatever else. Sometimes they are, right? But not a good default assumption. The last thing here, I want to finally focus on a few more lighthearted examples before we get back to talking about politics and so forth in the Q&A. But trial and error is really important. Having spent a lot of time now building models, releasing them to the public, I know that very often you can whiteboard things, you can scenario plan as much as you want. Until you actually have a product tested by actual users, by actual people, then you can be very surprised. I'll take an example here from poker instead. Way back in the day, I had a job, my first job out of college was being a transfer pricing consultant. I will not get into the details of what transfer pricing is, but it's roughly speaking as boring as it sounds. This came at a time when there was something called the poker boom around the country, where because of ESPN and hands like this one that you see depicted here, poker is becoming a very big thing in the United States. What this is a hand is from a screen cap from ESPN where Chris Moneymaker actually played Chris Moneymaker recently in a charity poker tournament. He is actually a very smart and skilled player and a nice guy. But this is a hand where he is bluffing against Sam Farha, this old kind of grizzled pro. Chris Moneymaker's draw a miss. He goes all in. Sam Farha folds, and Chris Moneymaker wins the pot. And he wound up actually winning the World Series of Poker that year. So he went from having a job like mine as a consultant, pay $20 to enter an online qualifying tournament, and wind up winning $2 million first prize to the main event at the World Series of Poker. The thing about poker, though, is that it's usually not that easy. For one thing, unlike the slide you see here, in the real world, you don't actually get to see what your opponent's cards are until after the hand, right? So you're watching on TV, it's as though you're clairvoyant. Much harder in the real world when their cards are face down. And in fact, when I played poker, I actually collected a lot of data on how different people were faring at the poker table. First of all, no surprise, but most players are losing players, and the worst players can lose a lot of money potentially. So if you go, and this is data taken from a now defunct site, I believe it's still defunct, maybe it's resurrected in some form, called Full Tilt Poker, and looking at if you rank from the worst player to the best player at a 10-person table, how much money is each player making or losing over the long run? So it turns out that, first of all, it's way easier to lose a lot of money than to make money, where the worst player is losing more than $400 per hour. The best player is only making $100 per hour. Part of that is because the house takes a cut called a rake, and so the average person will lose money kind of by definition. But still also reflects kind of the learning curve when it comes to complex data phenomenon. Or generally speaking, when you're trying to learn a new task, and especially when it comes to something involving analytics, or when you're trying to build a model, then you gain a lot in the first initial 20% of effort. This is an 80-20 curve, which is, for example, in sales, you sell 80% of your products, 20% of your customers, and so forth. Again, this also applies to when you're building a model very often, for example, where if you're looking at elections, right, then accounting for major stuff like incumbency and how the economy is doing and what the polls say, that will get you most of the way there. And the rest of that is some nuance on top of that, right? If you're playing poker, then getting the basics right, saying, okay, look, I'm going to fold my bad hands, call with my good hands, and raise with my very good hands, right? That's the right play 80% of the time or so, right? You have to bluff a little bit more, you have to slow play and trick people, but that's kind of the more advanced stuff. You'll actually be a lot less bad by getting that first 20% right. One more example of this from baseball, if you guys have read the book or heard of the book Moneyball, the story of Billy Beane and the Oakland A's. As Michael Lewis, great author by the way, tells the story, Billy Beane takes over as GM of the Oakland A's. He understands that on-base percentage is undervalued in the baseball community. If you can get on base, you can draw walks, you get hit by pitches, for example, that correlates very well with run scoring. Scoring runs correlates with winning games. Winning games means you win the World Series. The A's never did that, but you get the point, right? So this is kind of the story of Moneyball, where Billy Beane takes over. The A's OBP jumps way up. What you don't hear in Moneyball is the aftermath, where all of a sudden the A's OBP, kind of the year after Moneyball is written, begins to plummet down toward revert toward the mean. So what's happening there? Well, number one, when you see like a big bunch of low-hanging fruit, someone's going to pick that off before too long, and someone's going to copycat that behavior. So it may be true that that now and then there is a big, undiscovered, obvious liability or error that people are making, but it usually doesn't last for very long. So in the case of the A's, people are like, hey, actually, you know what? Billy Beane is right, that focusing on OBP is a great way to build a winning baseball team. But hey, we're the New York Yankees, the Boston Red Sox, Chicago Cubs, not the Tigers, unfortunately, as much. But we have lots and lots of money, and we can copy the A's analytics, and therefore we're going to have dominant teams that win 105 games every year, where the A's go back to being a small market team instead. Also, they realize that, hey, look, if you're a pitcher, you don't want to give up walks. It's a valuable intuition as well. And so the market adapts and evolves, and you don't always get to be on that early part where the learning and the growth is very steep. With that said, there is a lot to be said for improving incrementally along the margin and making marginal gains 1% at a time or 0.1% at a time. Every year when we build our election model, what I've been working on for the past few weeks, right? We could have just taken our 2016 model off the shelf and applied it. We were actually very proud of that model. I think it did a good job to give Trump a better chance than the convention of wisdom did or that another forecasted. But still, I like to rebuild my models every time we do them because you're learning a little bit at a time. And I believe that, hey, look, we are getting the big stuff right, we think, but like making a little improvement about how you analyze different types of polls. What happens when you have polls that seem to contradict one another, right? How do you measure the economy during a time of coronavirus? All those marginal improvements are often where in a competitive environment that you really differentiate yourself from. Again, it's great when you're an early adapter and you have an idea that no one else has really been able to apply at scale. unfortunately, it might only happen a couple of times in your career or your company's lifespan. You instead have to make continuous improvement around the margin. So again, I'm saying that like making small marginal incremental improvements is often the name of the game, and are things that you should be mindful of. One thing about Bayes' theorem, by the way, is that there's never actually an endpoint in Bayes' theorem. You start out with a belief, you collect evidence, you refine and revise that belief, and you get a little bit better over time. And it's a process of continued improvement. So I'll kind of sum up with this poem, I guess it is, from Piet Hein, who was a Danish scientist and author, who expresses what I think is a good attitude to take in the age of analytics. The road to wisdom, well, it's plain and simple to express, error and error and error again, but less and less and less. So thank you. Any prepared remarks now. I'm now open to take your questions. I'm sure there will be some stuff about 2020. Also happy to talk baseball or the NBA, those things that are more fun as well. But thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you, Nate. This concludes our general sessions for today. Make sure to check out the afternoon breakouts, visit the Developer Hub and Expo, and join us for the summit activities this evening. And as a final reminder, you are invited to participate in our summit matching program by clicking Donate Now in the side navigation. Let's get to 100K. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.